Welcome back everybody. Today I'm making a new video showcasing how to create a scene in the same vein that I did with the previous video about creating the Gothic church, but this time I'm making kind of an ancient cave or like a temple entrance. If you like what you're seeing here in these renders, then feel free to follow along. Unlike the previous project, this one is entirely made from Quixel Megascans, so you don't need to purchase anything or any third-party models or stuff like that. All of these assets that you're seeing were completely made by Quixel Megascans. So if you managed to grab these assets when they were available for free, you can follow along easily. So right off the bat, when you're starting, I ended up starting from the lowest point in the map, which is the little hole in the bottom that is containing water, and I ended up choosing a multitude of different rock meshes that made sense for the scene, which is either gray/white rocks and also rocks with greenery on top of it, like moss or grass or stuff like that. And I ended up just placing a variety of them at the bottom here, creating kind of like a well. And one thing that I tried to keep in mind for the hole in specific is that I didn't want to have any greenery on these rocks, because it doesn't really make sense for grass or other green life forms to exist on rocks that are submerged in water, because water is supposed to keep the rocks squeaky clean essentially. So I just looked at a couple of these meshes and chose whatever fit my image, and I just placed them in an arbitrary manner. As long as I'm creating a well shape, it was fine. I also wanted to make sure that I'm adding a lot of like spiky rocks, because I wanted them to protrude upward from the water. That gives it a cooler look. Feel free to increase the size of these rocks as you see fit, because some of these rocks look really cool but they're really small, so I just end up enlarging them multiple times over. It doesn't really matter when you're overlapping these meshes, because it's not really a game scene, so adding useless material is not really a big of a deal right now. And at the same time, these are really small parts in the whole bigger picture, so it's not going to be apparent at all, as well as the fact that this whole entire piece is going to be submerged in water, so it's not really going to be entirely apparent. Now, because these rocks look starkly different, some of them completely white, some of them darker, I ended up going into the material and shading these whiter rocks a little bit of a darker color to not make it seem so different, because it's not really natural to have a rock formation consisting of completely different rocks in this manner. I feel like it just doesn't fit. So I just went into the material and darkened some of these rocks to make them look like they belong in this rock formation. After placing a decent number of rocks, you can end up just selecting multiple ones of them and pressing Ctrl G to group them, so that you can multiply them over a lot easier. It streamlines the process of placing these rocks and it makes it not as tedious. I end up grabbing these massive cliffside rocks to end up creating the walls of my well, and as I'm rising up with height, I end up adding the green rocks, because the structure of this cave is going to have an opening in it, and the way that I envisioned this scene is that rain comes down from the opening in the cave creating the well of water at the bottom, but also the splattering of the rain will end up causing vegetation and grass to grow on the side walls and on the ground above, which is why I'm adding this grass-like ground on the walls of this well-like structure. It's going to be slightly finicky and frustrating trying to make all of these meshes look like they're perfectly aligned, because you will fix one side and then you will notice that the other side is protruding outward, or certain clipping just doesn't make sense. So it's going to take you a while to be able to fit everything in place appropriately, but just patiently handle each and every piece, and slowly but surely it will all start to look more homogeneous and it will make a lot more sense. After this, I start blocking out the path where the entrance and the exit of the cave is going to be, and I start modeling out the flooring of the cave essentially. And then I ended up adding a large amount of rocks to create a cave-like look, and I ended up adding this mannequin in here to give a sense of scale for the size of the cave, to have a better understanding. A problem with the rendering in Unreal Engine is because some of these rocks are only one-sidedly textured and you can't really double texture the rocks. Lighting just goes through the transparent side. So without the upper mesh that I placed, I just grabbed a random rock and I scaled it outward to cover the entire ceiling, because as you see here, when I remove it, the one-sided texture where it's transparent, the sun just goes through it and lights the floor beneath it, even though it shouldn't because it's covered with rocks. So a quick fix for that is just grab a flat rock and expand it on the X and Y scale to cover the entire ceiling, and now it looks more appropriate and dark on the inside. I ended up repeating the same procedure on both the entrance and the exit, and then came the fun process of creating the walls for the cave itself, which is essentially the same thing that I did for the tunnel, the entrance and the exit. You just grab a bunch of different rocks and place them around the whole place to make the walls and the upper opening of the cave. After creating a proper entrance on the upper side on the ceiling of the cave, I end up creating the wall of the opening on the upper side like a bottleneck to make it seem like it's an opening in the mountain. After this, most of the tedious work is done, and now we get on adding the little details that make the scene come alive. I start by adding these chain links to signify the entrance of the cave. So this is gonna be the way that you come in. And then I grabbed a long chain and I added it on top of each other like 100 times, and I grouped them together each and every time, and I duplicated it over and over to give the scene a more of a mystical look, as if this is like an enchanted cave or a shrine. It's recommended to delete some of the chains that are coming through the wall, not for anything but more so to save performance, because these chains going so high, I ended up creating like 1,500 different chains, so it ended up tanking my performance quite a lot. So I ended up deleting some of the chains that were going sky high, that weren't gonna be visible. After this, I started adding some pile of chains that will make it seem as if the chain is just collected at the bottom after it hit the ground. Then I ended up making a bridge that is supposed to like go across the opening in the ground, but then I decided to make it not go all the way across and appear as if it was broken or shattered, and I ended up adding the walls to, or the guardrails to the bridge itself. And I ended up grabbing a couple of planks and added it to the end of the bridge to make it look like it was broken. Obviously the texture of this wood doesn't really fit the bridge itself, so I ended up later going into the master material and altered the shading of the texture a little bit to make it better fit the bridge. Then I ended up adding a bunch of rocks on the sides to make it look as if rocks fell from above and or some of the guardrail was broken up into pieces to make it look more realistic. I ended up adding these lantern-like objects in between the guardrails to make it look a little better. Then comes the fun part, which is placing foliage down, because obviously the ground looks way too flat and you might start to notice the repetitive nature of the objects that I repeatedly copied. So the best way to hide these kinds of flaws is adding in foliage. I just downloaded what seemed to fit the scenery and I started placing them down. It's important to note that I focused on placing the foliage on the greener part of the scene and I sparsely placed them on the rocks, barely placing any on the rocks, because these white rocks are supposed to be cleaned by the rain when it comes down, and so because it lacks any greenery or any grass on it, it doesn't really make sense for plants to be growing on it. But I still placed a very few number and made them really small to make it seem as if plants are growing from in between the rocks itself. I also didn't place much on the entrance and the exit of the shrine or cave, because if you have a lot of people walking in and out of the place, or if this place is supposed to be managed, whoever is managing it is going to make sure that the place where people are walking is going to be cleaned and it wouldn't have a lot of plants growing on top of it. So I just placed a small number of really tiny plants. I also placed some sparse plants on the walls and on the protruding rocks. It's important to note that you won't be able to add water into your scene until you go into your plugins and enable the water plugin. But once you do, you can easily add a body of water. I recommend adding the lake one. You can also go with the custom, but the lake one already is preset up and you can easily edit it quickly, while the custom one will need a lot more finicking, and I just find the lake option to be much easier. Now obviously this water is way too active for the kind of environment that it's in, so I end up going into the settings of the waves and changing things to make it look more fitting for the environment that it's in. You can end up copying my settings. I recommend to just experiment on your own, see what works and what doesn't, and who knows, maybe you'll end up stumbling on better looking settings than I did. I ended up grabbing some vine plants because I wanted to make it so that vines will be coming down from the opening up top, signifying a lot of plant growth from the rain that's often coming down through this opening. And I just placed a couple of them, grouped them, and then placed more, grouped them again, and just did that over and over until I covered most of the opening. Now another plugin that you're gonna need to activate if you want to continue following me through this is the Niagara system, and that's because I'm going to end up creating a Niagara system to simulate falling leaves, as if some of the leaves from the vines were falling through the opening in the cave. Now, what I did to grab or to create a leaf mesh is an incredibly lazy solution, but it still works. But if you wanted a higher quality one, you can end up just creating one leaf mesh object in Blender and import it in. There are plenty of textures that you can find from Quixel, but they don't provide a readily made mesh. But what I ended up doing is I just created a plane and I expanded one of the textures from Quixel on top of it to make it look as if it's just one leaf. Obviously there are a lot of drawbacks and it is a really rudimentary method, but I was just feeling lazy, so that's what I went with. If you wanted a higher quality one, you can just create a very simple leaf mesh in Blender and import it and then texture it. As you can see here, Unreal has two leaf packs that are incredibly detailed and very high quality that you can just slap on top of your high quality mesh that you created on Blender, or if you want you can just copy my solution and it's going to work as well. Niagara is a system with an incredibly steep learning curve, so I'm not going to tackle much in here, but I just dabble slightly. You just want to change the size of your spawn area to make it cover the opening, and you add a force gravity modifier to make the leaves fall, and that's pretty much it. I just lower the spawn rate and stuff like that to make it look as realistic as possible. I ended up adding off screen these lanterns on the side walls and added lights to them to light up the cave. But with this you can see pretty much the scene is complete. I'm going to show you some renders and I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you found it informative. If you learned something or if you enjoyed this video, please leave a like and comment. If you have anything that you want to learn from generally any 3D software, Blender, Unreal, or anything like that, and I will hopefully be able to help you through it. Although currently I'm very much enjoying using Unreal. It is honestly such an incredible software. So for the foreseeable future, I'm most likely going to focus on it. But if you want to learn some things from ZBrush, Blender, Marvelous Designer, whatever it is, I also still use these programs very readily, so feel free to ask away in the comments and I will provide answers for your questions in as much detail as possible. Thank you very much for watching. Goodbye.